The gate camera caught her at 11:47 at night, standing in the rain with a car seat in one hand and a fireproof lockbox in the other. And for 11 minutes nobody at the Rocchi estate would open the door. Elena Rocchi had been buzzing the intercom since 11:30. She knew the guards recognized her face. She knew they had orders. She pressed the button one more time and said the only thing she had left to say. "Tell him it's Matteo's daughter. Tell him I have his brother's grandson in my arms. And I am not leaving this gate until somebody lets me say what I came to say." For a long moment nothing happened. Rain moved sideways under the security lights. The baby stirred against her chest, 3 months old, wrapped too thin for October, and Elena tucked the blanket tighter and did not let herself shake. Then the gate intercom clicked, and a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years said 4 words. "Let her come up." Dominic Rocchi met her on the front steps himself, which the guards would later say had not happened for any visitor in 3 years, not since the funeral nobody in the family had been permitted to properly grieve. He was 51 years old, grey at the temples, built like a man who had once worked the docks with his own hands and never quite let his body forget it. He had inherited the family's business the way most men in his line inherited things, abruptly too young with no real choice in the matter, and had spent 30 years since making sure no one ever again mistook him for someone who could be caught unprepared. He did not offer an umbrella. He stood in the rain and looked at the woman his family had not spoken of in years, and then he looked at what she was carrying. "You shouldn't be here, Elena. I know." Her voice didn't break. She had promised herself it wouldn't. "I wouldn't have come if there was anywhere else to go. Your father made his choice 8 years ago. Whatever you think you owe him, this isn't about what I owe him." She stepped forward, close enough that the porch light caught the small silver bracelet clasped around the baby's wrist, the kind hospitals give newborns, engraved because she'd paid extra for it, because some stubborn part of her had wanted it to mean something permanent. "This is about what you're going to owe him, once you see what I found in his office files 2 days before the bank locks the doors for good." Dominic's eyes moved from her face down to the bundle in her arms, and whatever he'd planned to say next didn't come. The baby's bracelet was turned toward the light. 6 letters plain as a dare. Dominic. He didn't move. Rain kept falling. Somewhere behind him a door opened and a woman's voice. His mother's. Called out asking who was there, and Dominic Rocchi, who had not forgiven his brother in life and had refused to forgive him in death, stood on his own front steps and could not make himself answer. 3 weeks earlier, Elena's life had looked like most single mothers' lives look at 2 in the morning. A spreadsheet open on a laptop balanced on a diaper box, a baby monitor propped against a coffee mug, and a stack of unpaid invoices she'd been avoiding since the funeral home bill cleared her account. Rocchi Freight and Dock Services had been her father's company before it was hers, a modest operation running produce trucks and warehouse contracts along the eastern waterfront. Matteo Rocchi had built it from nothing after he was cut loose from the family business. The other family business, the one nobody printed on letterhead, following a warehouse fire that killed 2 men and destroyed a shipment nobody ever fully accounted for. The official story, repeated at every Sunday table Elena had ever sat at, was simple. Matteo got greedy, Matteo got careless, Matteo got 2 men killed and tried to cover it by setting the fire himself. Dominic had disowned him within the month. Their mother had been forbidden to speak his name at family dinners. Matteo had spent the rest of his life 15 miles and one unbridgeable silence away from the only family he had, running a legitimate trucking company as if that alone might someday prove something to a brother who had stopped listening. He never got the chance. A heart attack took him at 53, 2 years before his grandson was born, and Dominic had not come to the funeral. Elena had grown up watching her father check the locks twice every night and never once explain why. She had grown up doing his books at the kitchen table because he trusted no accountant outside the family, and in doing them, she'd learned to read a balance sheet the way some people read faces, where the numbers hesitated, where they lied. She was good at her job. She was, by any fair measure, better with numbers than most of the men who had spent a decade telling her father he'd never amount to anything. What she was not good at, what she had never had the luxury of being good at, was letting things go. Across town, in a house with a view of the same waterfront, Dominic Rocchi ran a version of the family business their father had left him, one with cleaner accounting on the surface and considerably dirtier arrangements underneath, held together for 20 years by a man named Vittorio Salerno. Vittorio had been the one constant of Dominic's adult life. He'd stepped in as underboss when Dominic's father died young, had mentored Dominic through his first decade running the organization, had stood beside him at his brother's excommunication and quietly, patiently, made sure it stuck. He was smooth in rooms full of judges and city councilmen, generous at charity dinners, beloved by the very dockworkers whose union contracts he'd spent a decade quietly steering. Everyone who met Vittorio Salerno liked him. That had always been the most useful thing about him. Dominic's flaw, if you asked the handful of people who knew him well enough to name it, was not cruelty. It was trust laid down so early and so deep that it had fossilized. He had trusted Vittorio's account of the warehouse fire without reading a single incident report himself. He had let Vittorio manage the fallout, the insurance claims, the story that became family history, because Vittorio had never once given him a reason to check. 2 clues sat quietly in the world that week, unnoticed by everyone except the 2 people who would eventually need them. In a locked drawer in Matteo's old dispatch office, a duplicate freight ledger sat exactly where he'd hidden it 8 years earlier, its existence known to no one but a dead man and soon his daughter. And on the harbor calendar in 3 weeks' time, sat the date every longshoreman on that waterfront still marked in silence, the anniversary of the fire, and the annual memorial dinner the union held in the 2 dead workers' names. The same dinner where, 8 years ago, Dominic had stood up in front of 200 people and announced that his brother was no longer welcome in this family or on this waterfront. There was, in those early weeks, one brief moment of warmth in an otherwise grinding stretch of grief and bookkeeping. A Sunday afternoon when Elena's neighbor, an older woman named Fran who'd known Matteo for 20 years, showed up unannounced with a casserole and no agenda beyond keeping a new mother company for an hour. They didn't talk about the company or the funeral. They talked about nothing. A stray cat that kept getting into Fran's garden, whether the baby had his grandfather's stubborn chin, the particular exhaustion of doing everything alone. It wasn't much. But Elena would remember later that it was the last ordinary afternoon she had before everything else began. Elena didn't know any of that history in detail yet. She knew her father was dead, her company was drowning, and her son had been born into a silence she was tired of inheriting. She closed the laptop that night without finding what she was looking for. She would find it soon enough, and once she did, there would be no version of her life where she could simply look away again. The bank's letter arrived on a Tuesday. 90 days to bring the company current or the doors closed for good. The trucks repossessed, the dock lease reassigned. Elena read it standing in the kitchen with the baby asleep against her shoulder, and for the first time since the funeral, she let herself sit down on the floor and cry where no one could see her do it. Then she got up, because there was nothing else to do, and drove to the dispatch office to pull every file that might convince a loan officer her father's company was worth one more chance. The office hadn't been touched in 2 years. Dust sat thick on the shelves. She worked through the evening, box by box, and it was nearly midnight when she pried open the bottom drawer of her father's old desk, the one that had always stuck, the one she'd never once seen him open in front of anyone, and found a second ledger underneath a loose panel of particle board, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag like something he'd meant to hide from a search, not a spill. It was a duplicate of the freight manifest from the week of the fire. Except it didn't match the official version filed with the insurance company. The official version showed Matteo's crew working a late shift, unsupervised, careless with a space heater near stacked pallets of packing material. This version, dated, initialed, cross-checked against dock entry logs Elena recognized because she'd spent a decade learning to read exactly this kind of paperwork, showed that the warehouse's north office, the one where the fire started, had been locked that night. Locked and accessible to exactly 2 men. Her father's name was on the key holder list. So was another name she didn't expect. V. Salerno. She sat on the office floor with the ledger in her lap for a long time. She thought about burning it, the way her father apparently never had. She thought about taking the baby and disappearing somewhere Vittorio Salerno's name meant nothing, because she understood, sitting there, that whatever this ledger proved, it also meant her father had spent 8 years protecting a secret dangerous enough to be worth destroying his own name rather than speak it out loud. She thought about the 2 men who died in that fire, and the fact that somewhere right now 2 families still believed the story everyone had agreed to believe. She thought about her son's bracelet, the name she'd chosen for him without fully understanding, until that moment, why she'd chosen it. Some stubborn hope that a name could still mean family, even when the man wearing it had refused to act like one. Elena made her decision the way her father had apparently made his, all those years too late. She chose not to run. She packed the ledger into a fireproof lockbox that had belonged to her father, dressed her son for the cold, and drove to the one place she'd sworn since the funeral she would never go back to. The gate camera caught her at 11:47 that night. Everything that came after started there. Inside the house, Dominic set the lockbox on his study desk and did not open it right away. His mother, Carmela, stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at the baby Elena had finally, carefully, laid down in a borrowed bassinet a housekeeper produced from somewhere in the back of the house within 20 minutes of Elena's arrival. The kind of quiet, practiced competence that told Elena someone here still remembered how to prepare for family, even after years of pretending not to. "Say what you came to say," Dominic said. "Then I'll decide what happens next." Elena opened the box herself, because she didn't trust anyone else to touch it yet, and set the duplicate ledger on the desk between them. Dominic read for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his face had the flat, controlled stillness Elena would learn was how he looked right before he made a decision he didn't want to make. "This proves nothing," he said. "A key holder list from a warehouse office. Vittorio had access to half the buildings on that waterfront. That was his job. Then why did the official report never mention it? Because the official report was thorough enough for the fire marshal, the insurance company, and me." His voice hardened. "Your father built a second set of books hiding this from everyone but himself for 8 years. And you want me to believe that makes him innocent? I want you to open your eyes for 5 minutes, Elena said, and something in her tone made Carmela flinch by the door. "You disowned your own brother off one man's account of a fire he was standing 5 feet away from. You never once asked to see the incident report yourself. You let Vittorio hand you the story, and you swallowed it whole because it was easier than doubting the man who raised you after your father died." Dominic didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The silence did it for him. Within 2 days, the pressure started, quiet and reasonable, exactly the way Vittorio Salerno had always applied it. A representative from a shipping conglomerate Elena had never heard of called with a generous, all-cash offer for Rocchi freight and dock services. More than the company was worth on paper, enough to clear every debt and walk away comfortable. The bank that had sent her the 90-day letter suddenly found new reasons to delay her refinancing meeting by another 2 weeks. None of it had Vittorio's name on it. All of it had his fingerprints. Elena refused the buyout without telling Dominic she'd been offered it, and instead drove out to the waterfront to find the one man who might remember that night better than any ledger could. Sal Iommi had worked as dock foreman for 30 years and had retired the year after the fire, quietly, with a pension nobody questioned at the time. He answered his door wary and closed it halfway when he recognized her face. "You're Matteo's girl. I need to ask you about the fire. I already told everybody everything I know 8 years ago. Did you tell them who had the north office key?" Sal went very still. It took him almost a full minute to open the door the rest of the way. "Nobody ever asked me that," he said. "They asked what I saw. Nobody asked who could have gotten in there without breaking a lock." He told her what he remembered, that the north office had 2 keys issued, one to Matteo as shift supervisor, and one to the man who'd insisted on personally overseeing that shipment's paperwork because it was, in Vittorio's own words that week, too important to leave to the regular crew. Sal had never connected it to the fire investigation, because nobody had ever asked him to. It was the first thread pulling loose from 8 years of careful stitching, and standing in Sal Iommi's doorway, Elena understood for the first time that this wasn't only about clearing her father's name. Somebody had built a lie strong enough to survive 8 years and 1 funeral, and that somebody was not going to let it come apart quietly. Elena brought Sal Iommi's statement back to the estate expecting an argument. What she got instead was Dominic, alone in his study at 7 in the morning, pulling 20-year-old insurance files out of a storage box he clearly hadn't opened in a long time. "I want to see the original incident report," he said without looking up. "Not the summary Vittorio gave me. The original, filed with the fire marshal's office." It took 2 days and a favor from a retired city clerk to get a copy. When it finally came, Dominic read it standing at his desk, and Elena watched his face change in a way she hadn't seen since the porch steps. The original report listed 2 key holders for the North Office: Matteo Rocchi and Vittorio Salerno. The summary Vittorio had personally delivered to Dominic 8 years ago, the one Dominic had never questioned, the one that became the story their whole family lived inside for 8 years, listed only one name. "I signed off on the version he gave me," Dominic said quietly. "I never once asked to see the original. He told me my brother got 2 men killed, and I believed him because he'd never lied to me before that I knew of." He set the report down. "I disowned my own blood over a story I never checked." He picked up the phone that afternoon and called the retired fire marshal who had signed the original report, a man named Alvarez who had left the department years earlier and had never once, in 8 years, been asked a single follow-up question about the fire that had ended a family. Alvarez remembered the case clearly. Remembered, in fact, being surprised that no one from the Rocchi family had ever called him afterward, since the discrepancy between the 2 key holders had struck him as worth asking about even at the time. He'd simply filed his report, watched the story that circulated afterward diverge from what he'd actually written, and assumed someone above his pay grade had a reason for it. Nobody had ever corrected him, so he'd let it go, the way people do when a thing isn't technically their responsibility anymore. That conversation cost Dominic something to hear. It meant the truth hadn't been hidden at all, not really. It had been sitting in a public file for 8 years, available to anyone willing to make one phone call, and no one in his organization, including him, had ever bothered to make it. It was, Elena would realize later, the exact moment the midpoint of everything shifted. Not because the ledger or the report alone proved Vittorio guilty of anything beyond having a key, but because for the first time, Dominic's certainty cracked enough to let a second possibility in, that the brother he had punished for 8 years might have spent those same 8 years protecting the family from a truth about the man they all trusted more than they trusted him. The reversal cut both ways. Elena had assumed, walking into that study with Sal's statement, that she was building a case against a nameless conspiracy. She hadn't expected to learn that her father had known, or at least suspected, exactly who was responsible, and had chosen silence instead of exposure, for 8 years, right up until his death. "Why didn't he ever tell you?" Dominic asked her that evening, the 2 of them sitting at opposite ends of a long dining table neither had eaten from. If he knew Vittorio had a key, if he kept that ledger, why hide it instead of using it? Elena had been turning the same question over for days. "Because you'd already decided," she said finally. "Because the one time he tried to explain himself at the memorial dinner 8 years ago, you stood up in front of 200 people and told him he was no longer your brother. What was he supposed to do after that? Hand Vittorio's most loyal friend a piece of paper and hope you believed a stranger's ledger over the man who raised you?" Her voice caught just slightly. "He protected this family's peace by destroying his own name. I don't know if that was brave or a mistake. I think it might have been both." Dominic had no answer for that. He got up, walked to the window that faced the harbor, and for a long moment said nothing at all. The cost of the reversal wasn't only his. That night, Dominic drove to his mother's house alone and told Carmela Rocchi, for the first time in 8 years, that her younger son might not have been the man they'd all agreed to believe he was. Elena wasn't there for that conversation. She only knew, from the way Carmela's hands shook when she came to see the baby the following morning, that something in the family's foundation had genuinely moved. Vittorio, for his part, had not been idle. Within a week of the original report resurfacing, the shipping conglomerate's buyout offer for Rocchi Freight doubled, unprompted, and a rumor began circulating on the waterfront that Matteo Rocchi's daughter was shopping a forged document to anyone who'd listen, trying to extort money out of grief. Elena heard the rumor secondhand from a trucker who still respected her father enough to warn her. She had a moment that week, standing in the empty dispatch office with the company's 90-day letter still taped to the wall, where she let herself doubt whether any of this was worth what it might cost. Her son's safety, her father's remaining dignity, Whatever fragile trust was rebuilding itself between her and the uncle who had refused to know her for 2 years. She thought about taking the buyout, closing the office, disappearing to somewhere quiet with her son and letting the dead stay buried. She thought about the bracelet on her son's wrist, and the 2 families who still believed a lie about how their men died, and she put the thought away. That night she called Dominic and told him she wasn't taking the buyout, and she wasn't backing down whatever it cost either of them. It was, though neither of them said it aloud, the moment the plan stopped being about clearing one man's name and became something riskier, a plan that could genuinely fail. There was one more cost that week that Elena hadn't anticipated. Her father's old business partner, a quiet man named Ruben who'd stayed on as a driver after Matteo's death out of loyalty more than income, pulled her aside outside the dispatch office and told her, gently, that he thought she was making a mistake. "Some things are better left where they are," he said. "Your father made his peace with silence. Maybe you should too, for the boy's sake if nothing else." She understood he meant well. She also understood, standing there, that this was exactly the kind of well-meaning caution that had let a lie survive 8 years in the first place. Good people, tired of grieving, choosing the version of the story that required nothing further from them. She didn't argue with him. She thanked him for the years he'd given her father's company, and kept working through the night anyway, because some mistakes, if that was what this turned out to be, were hers to make. Vittorio Salerno had survived 20 years at the top of a dangerous business by never once looking desperate, and he did not start now. He invited Elena to lunch himself, at a quiet restaurant with a view of the harbor, and ordered for both of them before she'd finished sitting down. "You're your father's daughter," he said once the waiter had gone. "Stubborn. Good with numbers. I respected that about Matteo, right up until he cost 2 men their lives." He slid an envelope across the table without opening it. "I'm not your enemy, Elena. I'm offering you a way to take care of your son without dragging his name through a fight nobody in this family actually wants." Elena studied him across the table for a moment before answering, thinking of every story her father had told, and hadn't told, about the man sitting across from her now. She thought of how easily this same charm had convinced 200 people, including Dominic, to believe a lie for 8 straight years without a single one of them asking an obvious question. It occurred to her, watching him smile over the bread basket, that the most dangerous thing about Vittorio Salerno had never been cruelty. It was comfort, how easy he made it to stop looking. She didn't open the envelope either. "You had a key to that office. So did half the waterfront supervisors that year. Keys aren't a confession." He smiled, easy and warm, the smile that had charmed union bosses and city councilmen for 2 decades. "You're smart enough to know a key holder list isn't proof of anything in a courtroom, or at that dinner table you're so determined to bring this to. All it will do is make an old grief public again, and hurt people who've already buried their dead." It was, Elena understood, both a threat and an honest assessment of what she actually had. A duplicate ledger, a foreman's memory, and a name on a key holder list weren't enough on their own. She left the envelope on the table, unopened, and told him she'd think about it, because she needed him to believe, for a little while longer, that he still had time. 2 days later, Sal Iomi's small waterfront apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except a box of old union paperwork he'd mentioned to Elena in passing, dispatch radio logs from his final years as foreman, boxes he'd kept out of habit long after anyone asked for them. Sal called Elena shaking, more angry than afraid, and told her he'd already made copies of the relevant pages years ago, tucked inside a hollowed-out toolbox in his garage, the paranoid habit of a man who'd never quite trusted the official story either. It was that instinct, more than any plan Elena or Dominic had built, that produced the 4th piece of the case. A dispatch radio log from the night of the fire, time-stamped, showing that the North Office alarm had been manually disarmed 12 minutes before the blaze was reported. Disarmed using a code issued only to Vittorio Salerno, logged under his name, at 11:52 p.m., while Matteo's shift crew was 2 buildings away loading a different truck entirely. Elena brought the log to Dominic that night, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his gate, she set a condition instead of a request. "I'll give you everything I have," she said. "The ledger, the report, Sal's statement, this log. But I decide how the truth comes out. Not a quiet meeting behind closed doors where he apologizes and disappears somewhere comfortable. Not anything that ends with him hurt and nobody outside this family ever learning what really happened to my father's name. She held his gaze. I want it said out loud, in front of the same people who watched you disown him. That's the only ending I'll accept. It was not how the organization Dominic ran typically handled a man who had lied to its boss for 8 years and gotten 2 people killed in the process. Every instinct that had kept Dominic alive in his business told him quiet was safer, and violence was simpler, and a public reckoning risked everything. His authority, his organization's stability, the fragile peace he'd only just begun rebuilding with his own mother. He agreed anyway, though it took him the better part of an hour of silence at his desk to say so, turning the radio log over in his hands as if it might tell him something the words on it hadn't already made clear. Elena didn't fill the silence. She'd learned enough about him in 3 weeks to know that pushing him toward a decision only made him dig in against it, and that whatever he decided in that quiet needed to be his own choice, not one she'd talked him into. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't about Vittorio at all. Your father used to run supply routes with me, before either of us had a say in anything, he said. We were 17. He used to say the whole business ran on people agreeing not to look too closely at each other's excuses, because everybody needed everybody else's silence eventually. He set the log down. I think he was right, and I think it cost him his life, and I'm not interested in running the rest of mine that way. The memorial dinner is in 4 days, he said. Same room. Same people who were there 8 years ago. He looked at her for a long moment. You'll have the floor, Elena. I'll make sure of it. It cost him something real to say it, and they both knew it. A debt to 20 years of trusting Vittorio's judgment over his own, a debt Dominic had never planned on having to pay in front of an audience. But he said it, and did not take it back, and for the first time since the porch steps in the rain, Elena let herself believe he meant it. In the 4 days that followed, Vittorio Salerno grew quieter, more careful, and for the first time in years, genuinely afraid, though he covered it well enough that almost no one but Dominic noticed the difference. He believed, right up until the night of the dinner, that whatever Elena had, it would break apart the moment real pressure was applied to it, the way every threat against him always had before. He was wrong, and on the morning of the memorial dinner, Elena stood in her father's old dispatch office one last time, packed the ledger, the report, Sal's written statement, and the radio log into the same fireproof lockbox she'd carried to Dominic's gate 3 weeks earlier, and drove toward the same waterfront hall where her father had been disowned in front of 200 people 8 years before. The waterfront Union Hall was full by 200 longshoremen, family members, and old guard associates gathered under the same water-stained banner that had hung there 8 years earlier, honoring the 2 men who died in the warehouse fire. Vittorio Salerno stood near the head table in a gray suit, shaking hands, laughing at somebody's joke, exactly as comfortable as he'd been every year since the story had settled into permanent, unquestioned truth. Dominic rose first, before the usual memorial remarks began, and the room quieted the way rooms quieted for him. 8 years ago in this hall, I stood where I'm standing now and told you my brother was responsible for the deaths of 2 good men, and that he was no longer welcome in this family or on this waterfront. His voice carried without needing to be raised. I was wrong. I want you to hear the truth from someone who has more right to tell it than I do. He looked toward the back of the hall, where Elena stood with the lockbox in both hands, and nodded once. She walked the length of that room the way she imagined her father must have walked it 8 years earlier, and set the box down on the head table in front of 200 witnesses and one man whose smile had finally, visibly, begun to fail. My father kept this hidden for 8 years because he believed no one would take his word over Vittorio Salerno's, she said. I'm not asking you to take my word either. I'm asking you to look at what's in front of you. She laid out the original incident report first, the version with 2 key holders' names on it, not one, and let it sit on the table long enough for the room to read it for themselves. Then Sal Iami's written statement, and Sal himself standing near the front, confirming in his own voice what he'd told no one for 8 years because no one had ever thought to ask. Vittorio found his footing quickly, the way a man who has talked his way out of worse things his whole life always does. A key holder list. A retired foreman's memory, 8 years old. This is grief looking for someone to blame, and I understand it, but it isn't proof. You're right, Elena said. It isn't. This is. She set the dispatch radio log on the table last, the timestamp and the disarm code circled in red ink, Vittorio's authorization number logged at 11:52 p.m., 12 minutes before the fire was called in, while Matteo Rocchi's crew was 2 buildings away on record with a different loading job entirely. The room went silent in a way that had nothing performed about it. You disarmed that alarm yourself, Elena said, looking at Vittorio directly for the first time. Not my father. And when it went wrong, you let a man you'd worked beside for 15 years take the blame for it. And you let his brother disown him in front of everyone in this room. And you let him die 2 years ago without ever telling the truth, because the truth would have cost you everything you've spent since then protecting. Somewhere in the second row, a woman Elena didn't recognize had gone pale and still, one of the 2 families the fire had taken from, Elena would learn later. Hearing for the first time in 8 years that the story she'd been told about how her husband died was not the whole of it. It was the kind of moment no amount of preparation made easier to witness. Vittorio's composure didn't shatter all at once. It went in stages. First a denial too quick and too smooth to land, then an appeal to Dominic directly, 20 years of loyalty laid out like a debt owed. Then, when Dominic's face gave him nothing back, something closer to the truth than he'd spoken aloud in 8 years. It was an accident, he said, quieter now, to the room instead of to Elena. The heater. I never meant for anyone to die. And when it happened I was afraid. Afraid of what it would cost me. What it would cost this whole operation if the truth came out that I'd been careless enough to kill 2 men. Matteo found out. He was gonna go to Dominic. I told him if he did, I'd make sure it looked like it was his fault instead, and he had a young daughter and... He stopped. I told myself I'd fix it eventually. I never did. Dominic stood, and the room's attention swung back to him. And for a long moment he said nothing at all, weighing visibly 20 years of trust against a room full of people waiting to see what kind of boss he actually was. You had 8 years, he finally said. 8 years. And you let me disown my own brother rather than tell me the truth once. His voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. You're removed. Effective tonight. Not killed, not made an example of with blood in this hall. That's not the ending my niece asked for, and she's earned the right to decide how this ends. You're exiled. No territory, no protection, no name in this family's business again as long as you live. And restitution starts tomorrow. To the families of the 2 men who died, and to my brother's daughter, whose company you tried to steal twice. Vittorio looked, for the first time in 20 years, like a man with nothing left to charm his way out of. He was escorted from the hall without violence, exactly as Elena had insisted, and the 200 people who watched him go understood, without needing it explained further, that the story they'd all agreed to believe for 8 years had just come apart in front of them. Elena stood at the head table afterward, the lockbox empty now, every piece of proof laid bare in front of the same room that had once cheered her father's disgrace. Someone in the crowd, one of the old dockworkers who'd known Matteo since they were boys together on that waterfront, started quietly to clap. It spread slowly through the hall, not triumphant, more like an apology finally being paid to a dead man who could no longer hear it. Salaiami found her there in the parking lot, and stood beside her without saying much of anything for a while, the way old men who've known a family a long time sometimes know exactly how little needs to be said. Your father would have hated all that attention, he finally offered. But he'd have been proud you didn't let it stay buried with him. It wasn't a grand statement. It didn't need to be. Elena wiped her face, adjusted the baby's blanket against the night air, and thanked him for a decade of loyalty her father had never gotten to properly repay. Inside the hall, the room slowly returned to something like its normal rhythm. Plates cleared, quiet conversations resuming in clusters, the specific relief of people realizing a truth they'd half suspected for years had finally, mercifully, been allowed to surface. Dominic found Elena in the parking lot 20 minutes later. His jacket still damp from the walkout, and didn't say much either. He looked at his grandnephew, asleep and oblivious to the whole evening, and then at Elena and said only, "Your father would have been the first one clapping in there. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't meant to be." It was, Elena understood, as close as Dominic Rocchi was capable of coming to one that night. And for now it was enough. Elena didn't cry until she was outside in the parking lot, with her son asleep against her shoulder and 8 years of her father's silence finally, fully spoken. The consequences didn't finish that night, and Elena hadn't expected them to. Real repair takes longer than one confrontation, however satisfying, and the story earned its ending slowly, over the weeks that followed rather than in a single triumphant scene. Vittorio Salerno's exile was formalized within days. No territory, no protection, no standing in the organization he'd spent 2 decades helping run. Restitution began almost as quickly. Dominic personally arranged compensation for the families of the 2 men who had died in the fire, an acknowledgement 8 years overdue, delivered quietly and without cameras, because some debts aren't paid for an audience. Rocchi Freight and Dock Services kept its dock lease and its trucks. The bank's 90-day letter became, within a month, a restructured loan Elena could actually manage, not as charity from an uncle buying his guilt back, but as a business arrangement she negotiated herself, on terms she checked twice before signing. The systemic change went further than one company's survival. Dominic instituted something the organization had never had before: an independent review of any incident report before it reached him as final, a small, unglamorous safeguard built entirely out of the recognition that the last time he'd taken one man's word as settled fact, it had cost his brother 8 years and in the end, his life. It wouldn't undo what had already happened. It made it considerably harder for it to happen again to someone else's brother. The personal healing was slower and less clean. Carmela Rocchi visited her dead son's grave for the first time in 2 years, with Dominic beside her, and Elena watched from a respectful distance as the 2 of them stood in silence longer than either of them had words for. Dominic didn't say much about it afterward. He didn't need to. The following week, he asked Elena, almost awkwardly, whether the company could use a legitimate freight contract with one of his above-board logistics partners. Not a bailout, just an honest opportunity, the kind her father had spent a career being denied. She thought about it for exactly 1 day before saying yes, on her own terms, with her own lawyer reviewing the paperwork first. As for what stood unspoken between Elena and Dominic by the end of it, something had shifted there too, though neither of them rushed to name it. There was a quiet Sunday weeks later, when Dominic showed up at her door with takeout and no particular reason, and stayed long enough to watch his grandnephew fall asleep in his arms without once mentioning business. There was an argument, a real one, over whether Dominic's driver should shadow Elena's deliveries for safety. She refused flatly, said she'd spent her whole life being told powerful men would handle things for her, and she wasn't interested in trading one kind of control for another. Dominic backed down, visibly frustrated, and respected it anyway, because it cost him something to learn that trust and control weren't the same thing, and he was only just beginning to learn the difference. Whatever grew between them after that grew slowly, built on ordinary Tuesdays and small kept promises rather than any single grand gesture, which was perhaps the only kind of trust either of them had reason left to believe in. Fran, the neighbor who'd once shown up with a casserole on an ordinary Sunday, came by again a few months later, this time to meet the baby properly, and stayed long enough to tell Elena, without any particular ceremony, that her father would have liked seeing the company's name still painted on the trucks. It was a small thing. Elena had learned over the past months that most of the healing that mattered came in small things. An old ledger closed for good, a debt finally paid, a name spoken out loud at a dinner table instead of avoided. The last symbolic thread closed itself almost by accident. 6 months after the memorial dinner, Elena took her son to the harbor for the first time, to the same dock her father had walked 1,000 times, and clipped a small new bracelet onto his wrist beside the hospital one she'd never taken off. His full name this time, Dominic Matteo Rocchi, both names his mother had finally earned the right to give him without flinching. There is a version of loyalty that means defending a person no matter what they've done, and a version that means telling them the truth even when it costs you everything you built together. Dominic Rocchi spent 8 years living inside the first kind, and one autumn night on his own front steps, in the rain, with his brother's grandson in a stranger's arms. He finally had to choose the second. Elena's father chose silence for 8 years, to protect a family that never knew it needed protecting from the wrong man. Neither choice was easy, And neither man got to see how the story ended the way he might have wanted. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you were Dominic, and the person who raised you in business turned out to be the one who destroyed your family, would you have been able to hear the truth from someone you'd already decided not to trust? And if you were Matteo, protecting a secret that could cost you your own name for 8 silent years, would you have made the same choice or found the courage to speak sooner, whatever it cost you? If this story moved you, the truest way to honor it is simple. Don't wait 8 years to ask the harder question. Like this video, subscribe for more stories like it, and tell me in the comments, silence or the truth. Which one would you have chosen?